I'd like to take a moment now to introduce our final keynote speaker. I was introduced before, but just in case you don't remember, I'm Jack Knott, and I'm the Dean of the USC Sol Price School of Public Policy. I want to do two things, though, before I introduce our speaker. One of those, I think Jim is going to do also a little bit later, but it's hard for him to thank himself. So I would really like it if we could thank Elwood and Jim and Nick and Ferris for a fantastic event. And of course, we also thank all of our speakers and our sponsors and all of the audience. You've really been terrific. There's one other thing I'd like to do before I introduce the speaker, and that is I'd like to introduce, we are very fortunate today to have the benefactor from our school here, Mr. Robert Price. He's sitting back there. Please thank him. One of the things Jim alluded to yesterday is that FedMart, which became Price Club and then eventually merged with Costco, is one of those inclusive capital companies. They have they pay living wage. They don't contract with sweatshops. They treat their customers well. At the same time, they've also heavily invested in the community where their headquarters is in San Diego. In addition, Sol Price and Robert have been very involved in national policy through the Urban Institute and the National Center for Budget and Policy Priorities, et cetera. So that kind of policy, community, market role they epitomize in a really wonderful way, and that's one of the reasons we're so proud to have their name on our school. So, thank you. So now, let me introduce our keynote speaker, Henry Cisneros. What a fitting way to wrap up this wonderful forum on the important role of place-based initiatives. Henry has been a long-time national advocate for educational achievement, equality, and opportunity, and has been a tireless leader working to alleviate poverty through community-based initiatives. He has a very special career in this because he started out at the community level. He served for 3 terms as a council member in San Antonio, then becoming mayor, where he was really known for infrastructure and housing and community transformation. He also, following that, was nominated by Bill Clinton to serve as the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development in the Clinton administration. So he went from that local community base to national policy in which he focused on homelessness, revitalizing communities, and increasing the rate of home ownership for underrepresented groups. And like a growing number of graduates from the Price School, although Henry is not a graduate of the Price School, he's a graduate of the Kennedy School at Harvard, and he also has a PhD from George Washington University. Our students are increasingly working across the sectors. They're not just going into government or the nonprofits or business. They're over their careers working across the sectors. And that's true of Henry's career as well. So in the nonprofit sector, he served as president of the National League of Cities and chair of the National Civic League. He also is a prominent national advocate for Latino and Hispanic community. He's the co-creator of the National Hispanic Leadership Agenda and co-founder of the New American Alliance, which is a national organization united to promote economic advancement of the American Latino community. In addition, he has received numerous awards and honors for the work that he has done, and also from magazines. The one, as a political scientist, I'm quite impressed by, and that is the Hubert Humphrey Award that he received from the American Political Science Association, which is award that is given to somebody who's made a huge impact as a political leader, but also made a huge contribution to political science. In the private sector, Henry has been the CEO of Univision, which is now the 5th largest audience-watched TV network, news network in the country, and currently is the founder and CEO of CityView, which is a company that works on affordable housing and has partnered with about 60 different organizations around the country. He serves on the boards of the Gates Foundation as well as the Broad Foundation, but the one we're most proud of is he serves on the Board of Counselors for the Price School of Public Policy. He's been a tremendous friend and advisor. He's helped us identify other people for the board. He's worked with us on fundraising. He's worked with us on curriculum and the mission of the school, and he's been terrific as a board member. And in addition, he's a member of the Trojan family. His son, John Paul, is a graduate of our school from a couple years ago. And just to tell you what kind of person Henry is, Henry came to my office and had worked out very carefully all the skills and knowledge bits and information that he felt John Paul needed in order to get a credible degree from USC. I still have that. It's all handwritten, but it was brilliant. So he cares about family, and he cares about education, and it's just my great privilege to introduce to you political leader, social advocate, author, and business entrepreneur, Henry Cisneros.
Thank you, Jack. Thank you very much. And just to tell you the kind of dean that Jack is, he allowed John Paul to stray from the catalog of what was required to get a degree here in the Price School and take courses at the Marshall School of Business and in education and in infrastructure. And, well, he's doing very, very well, thanks to Jack's interventions. The only correction I would make in Jack's introduction, in the spirit of Latino Los Angeles and immigration reform, on some nights, if you pick the night correctly, Univision is the #1 broadcaster in the country. And I saw outside Jack's wife, Cherry, who is a very special person. I'm going to ask her to stand and be recognized in a minute, because this is a woman who was a member of Parliament in England and had a career as an opposition leader in the Parliament. And again, I guess it's testimony to Jack's persuasive skills. He was able to bring her across the pond. She left her career to come here and be the wife of the dean of the Price School. Cherry, would you please stand and just let me say. But a real international heroine. I also want to thank Jim Ferris and Elwood Hopkins for the work that they've done. They've done a lot of work on a lot of fronts. I followed Jim's work in the articulation of the values of philanthropy for a lot of years. And I was frankly surprised in a really pleasant way when they opened the dialogue about place-based, because I hadn't heard anybody talking about place-based as a strategy for social change in a long time. When I was Secretary of HUD, it was clear to me that one of the things that made the department different was that, in contrast to many of the other federal agencies that looked at budgets and programs and delivery systems that in some cases went directly to individuals, like Social Security checks that go to the mailbox of individual houses, that this was a department, HUD, that had place responsibility. So we started to talk about a framework for thinking in places and creating accountability in places. And I like to think that we were successful in sort of reorienting the department's thinking in that way, but I hadn't heard anyone really seriously articulating that logic in a very long time. Very pleased that Elwood and Jim started this dialogue over a year ago. A serious set of questions, tracked across the country and held hearings with prominent people in major cities across the nation, and the result is some very good thinking. Although I do want to make the case today that we've got to go far beyond thinking, as Mike Rubinger did in that last session, and focus on really what's happening in communities, where people are, where voices are to be heard. But I do want to express my respect for this effort. It's a complicated subject because at one level, it's very theoretical and abstract to try to think, well, what does place mean and how do you focus differently when you're thinking about place? But on the other, it's the most grounded of conversations possible because it's the real thing. And I have found it over the years as a good discipline to determine whether or not we're having success. As the people in my neighborhood would say, keep it real, dude. And place allows you to really think in terms of keeping it real because you're focusing on what you can see and what you can reach. A good part of my work and life has been, at the intersection of the theoretical level, but also working in community. So early in my work as a White House fellow and working for the Department of Housing and, Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, it was called then, and then work at Harvard and MIT on urban subjects, was very sort of big scale, 30,000 feet ideas, rewarding people who could manipulate data and talk in research terms. And then I went home and moved into my grandparents' old home on the west side of San Antonio and ran for the city council. And it was a very, very different dialogue, a very different description of the way life works. As a city council member, working with people in the neighborhoods, as a mayor, focusing on economic development and jobs and the regional economy. And then President Clinton asked me to go to HUD, and I there was exposed to the duality that I described a moment ago. On the one hand, a federal department with a $30 billion budget and 10,000 employees trying to drive programs through silos, and on the other, looking at it from the perspective of the people that I knew who were mayors. I visited over 200 different American cities in every one of the 50 states, and Native American nations and rural communities, it's a very different sense of how the federal government relates to communities when you see it from that perspective. A couple of observations, if I may, about place-based, observations gleaned over the years. First of all, from a common sense standpoint, it's a very valid way to think about how government interfaces with people's lives. It's the natural basis for where you can have impact because it relates to what we see. It relates to the natural reach of people in neighborhoods and in the subsets of cities. It is related to the historical mapping of our society. It's broken into counties, it's broken into cities, it's broken into sub-districts of all kinds, census and otherwise. And so human nature allows us to think in terms of political subdivisions and neighborhoods, sometimes not those that are mapped out, but those that have traditions and histories, subsets of a city, for example, that nobody knows exactly where they begin or end, but we know that Little Italy is a certain kind of place in most cities, or the North End in Boston has a certain tradition and history, and Southie in Boston is a very different place from it. And we have a sense for whether or not we're making progress, whether we're making impact in those places. It's also clearly where the people are and where they have voice. And we've come up with ideas like placemaking and livable places. I had the privilege as a graduate student of working in Lyndon Johnson's 1968 Model Cities program, which was all about subsets of cities and trying to bring a focus of different kinds of public services into those subsets. Watched the Ford Foundation and its work, for example, in Bedford-Stuyvesant in the late 1960s. So place has always seemed to me to be the common sense place conceptually to focus government. Secondly, it's an important organizing framework for government. As I said, some elements of government don't think in terms of place, like the Treasury that sends out those Social Security checks, Or, for example, when the Congress passes a national law, like civil rights laws that are to protect everyone, all 310 million of us, for example, but not necessarily focused on places. And yet, we know that things go wrong. They don't reach the people they're supposed to reach, that it isn't enough just to have government outreach in the form of a transfer payment, for example, that we need all kinds of intermediations and interventions. And so the middle ground, if you will, are places where the people are, places where there are agents of government, places where we can organize in a way that relates to physical ground. And I felt very strongly about that at HUD. I tell a story about a discussion I had with an executive from Pepsi, the Pepsi company, who was describing the way they had flipped their organizational chart at Pepsi upside down. Instead of the typical pyramidal organizational chart, they had the chart upside down, and the point at the bottom was the person in the Pepsi organization who puts the soft drink on the shelves and sets up the sign that points to people where the soft drink is. And they looked at the rest of the organizational structure and worked it backward from that and said, everyone else, the distributors, the manufacturers, the executives in marketing, the CEO are in support of that person. And it struck me in my years at HUD, having heard that conversation, that that was the right description for how we needed to organize the department. Organize down to the level of communities and whether or not we were making a difference on the ground, and work everything backward from that. So it's a very useful organizing principle, place is, for how we can structure government correctly. A third observation is that place allows us to create a place for integration of programs on the ground, breaking down the silos of the Department of Commerce and the Department of Labor and the Department of Education and the Department of Housing, and figuring out how they can collaborate both at the top levels within the government, but more importantly, how these funding approaches, which in the report that emerged from this last year is described as braided funding, can come together. And that's why programs like Choice and like Promise Zones and even Hope 6 on my watch are so important, because they create the physical setting in which everyone can funnel together resources and create the basis for cooperation on the ground. Cooperation among local government units, cooperation with nonprofits, but creating the physical space in which collaboration can occur. So it's an important system for integration. And finally, I would say, in terms of these sort of theoretical ideas about place, is that it's an important locale or venue for accountability, because we can see by measuring within physical place whether or not we're making progress or not. We can evaluate, very important part of the policy-making process, again, in a physical place. We can see, we can feel, we can know in places. So the whole concept of place is very important, and again, I applaud Elwood and Jim and the rest of the team that recognized it and worked on it. Now, our country is focused today on a place, and that place for the last months and certainly in the last few weeks has been a small place, but with big implications, and that is Ferguson, Missouri. I've had the opportunity to be in Ferguson in years past, because Ferguson is like a lot of other places in the United States that have had the same trajectory. Places that were once suburbs, but then we saw the movement of poor people into those places, unprepared from a governance standpoint, unprepared from a housing standpoint. Places like Harvey outside of Chicago, some of the suburbs of Baltimore, I had a conversation just yesterday with a man named Richard Barron, who is arguably the best in the country at having done urban revitalization strategies. He was present when we drafted the regs for Hope 6, and he's done something like 30 major renovations of the biggest and worst public housing developments in the country. And while that program, Hope 6, is very much place-based and focused on taking areas that were off limits to any kind of private sector interest or investment, they literally were roped off from the rest of cities in many places. And the result was to reduce the density and to allow people to use Section 8 to move to other places. The result was, in some cases, places like Ferguson. And there's a connection between the kind of renovation efforts in central cities and the kinds of places like Ferguson that have developed. But it's not just suburban settings, it's also South Central where we encounter the conditions that we've seen in Ferguson, right immediately around this neighborhood, and Compton up the street, and Camden across the way from Philadelphia, and Newark across the way from New York, and the 3rd Ward of Houston, and East St. Louis on the other side from Ferguson of St. Louis, and neighborhoods of Chicago and Baltimore and Gary and rural places like Tupelo in the Mississippi Delta and the Navajo Nation in New Mexico, where the same kinds of conditions exist in places, where we see a breakdown of systems. So while Ferguson has been described as a policing practices crisis or a failed environment of economic opportunity for young African American males, it is also the story of a place where poverty has become concentrated in a way in which poverty is isolated, a place where there's lack of opportunity for young African American men, a place where there's lack of education and training pathways, and therefore few pathways toward improvement in life, where we have the reality of a segmented labor market, a segmented educational system, a segmented housing market, and a segmentation of attitudes. Attitudes on the part of the police that relate to profiling and so forth, and attitudes on the part of youthful young men who are behaviorally reacting to the sense of abandonment. Abandonment by the economy, abandonment by any support systems. When I talked to Richard Barron yesterday, he said he had just been there because McCormick Barron, the company he created, and this magnificent, admirable company that has done the country's best work in renovating urban settings, is in St. Louis. It was founded in St. Louis. So this is his backyard. He went to Ferguson a couple of days ago and he said, it's the worst in terms of the quality of housing that was provided. Acres and acres, blocks and blocks of the worst of housing with no recreational facilities, no training facilities. And this is a man who, I understand his language, and he was describing to me the kinds of things I've seen in places like Camden and East Chicago and other places. But the point is that there is a reason why we see environments like this occur in these places, and they harden into racial tensions. They're the result of some structural dysfunctions, structural failures, like, for example, housing discrimination. Housing discrimination is real. People are steered to neighborhoods, and they are disallowed to reside in other places in sometimes subtle ways and sometimes not so subtle ways. But it's real, and it destroys the functioning of our housing markets. When I was at HUD, we had 14 different departments within the department, 4 subsets of the department, and one of the least understood and least celebrated was the fair housing department. And yet, without an understanding of fair housing and how it works, the housing markets don't work. So even though it's 1/14, if you will, of the functioning of the department, it has a huge significance. Because if there's no ease for people to be able to move into housing on a fair way, then the rest of the housing markets don't work. It's one of those kinds of places, bits of logic where economists say, well, if this works, and if this works, and if this works, then you reach this conclusion. But the truth of the matter is, if this doesn't work, then the whole economic model breaks down. And that's what happens in our urban housing patterns, which bleed over into urban educational patterns, if something like the system of fair housing is dysfunctional. So we see the results of that, of a demoralizing physical setting, of everything in decline, of a regional economy in transition. St. Louis is one of those old American manufacturing centers, which even though it has been making very substantial efforts in recent years to transform to the biosciences, for example, big hospital complexes, University of Washington, biomedical research, and others, still, in many, many parts of St. Louis, there just isn't enough juice to create jobs and create an uplifting economy that can move people to the middle class. So that becomes part of the context. And then you find these suburban places that are just not ready to accept the kind of outward migrations from the central city that have occurred as the concentrations of poverty within the older central city, quite understandably, had to be reduced. The first of the big housing developments to be blown up in America, long before my time, 20 years before I became secretary, was Pruitt-Igoe in St. Louis. And so there's been a steady pattern of taking down the high-rises that didn't work without sufficient thought as to where people would go. And they've ended up in places like these that I've described, including specifically in Ferguson, outside of St. Louis. So my point of going through this is to ask, what does the concept of place-based mean for a place like Ferguson? As we think about next steps in the evolution of these theoretical ideas, place-based, how does it hold up if we test it against what we know about Ferguson? And that's the real test as we think through an idea like place-based. I went through and described earlier how it's an organizing concept and how it's an accountability concept and how it's an integrating concept. But are those things real? Can we make them really work when we put them through the test of a place like Ferguson, which is not unique on the American scene? There are too many Fergusons, exactly like Ferguson, where people have moved out from the city. And there are too many places in the hearts of our cities, and there are too many places in our rural areas and in our Native American nations where these circumstances of inequality and inequity exist. So as I think about next steps, and I want to close my remarks here in a second because I do think the most important thing we can do is take some questions and talk for a moment. As I think about the next steps for this concept, it strikes me that we need to be thinking about how we find the middle ground in our system, the middle places in our system. Not the federal government, because we know that it is in retrenchment for reasons of budgets and finances and political philosophy and contention and stalemate, and not what individuals will do for themselves, even with transfer payments, but where we can create the settings in which collaboration is possible among people in physical places. My favorite choice for the right middle ground is the cities. I'm a cities guy. I've been doing cities all my life. And cities is the first level up from the individual where you have the power to collect taxes and aggregate money and actually have some resources to put to work. Cities have generally thought of themselves as places, traditionally, where we provide basic services: water, fire, police, streets maintenance, the basic things that it takes to keep a society functioning. And cities for years were celebrated as places that did this in the most businesslike and neutral fashion. Just provide the services in an efficient way. In recent years, since the war on poverty, since the 1960s, cities have evolved to include a range of other things that we did because the need was so great. So economic development to create jobs, and social services to extend to people in need, services for the homeless, increasingly nutrition programs and specialized programs for the elderly, things we do because there is a need. I'd like to make the argument that the next evolution of place-based is to integrate equity strategies and places in cities. So that traditionally we thought of the federal government as a place where you go for equity. Just yesterday I heard Al Sharpton say on television after the events in New York that it's time to call on the federal government to play the role that it played in the 1950s and the 1960s, which is the last voice, the last resort for equity, to stand up where people are being hurt and local people aren't doing the right thing about it. That's a noble role for the federal government. We honor it in our system. It needs to continue. I recognized it in my day at HUD when we were dealing with communities who were failing their citizens, and though we were asked to give them more power and responsibility, we were reluctant to do that because we would be relinquishing the protector role, the mediator role, to try to be fair to people in the process. But more and more, with the political changes that have occurred at the city level, we can move from doing things because they're compassionate or because there is a humanitarian need to an assertive role of equity, taking over some not taking over, but supplementing responsibilities of the federal government and doing with the powers that exist in places strategies which foster a more egalitarian society, a more equitable society. And we can do that by more aggressively pulling our programs together and focusing on things like jobs and the job market, wages and the fairness of livable wages, things that relate to the quality of education and who it's afforded to, and whether we have the best system of providing the best education for children in need, whatever the form, whether it's public schools or charter schools or magnet schools or parochial schools, but being aggressive about offering the best quality education for children at the city level, and all of the other things that we can do that relate to the basic functions of cities. Cities are places where people live. Cities are places where people work. Cities are places where people learn. Cities are places where people gather and play. And cities are places where people govern themselves. And at each level of those functions of the city, we can apply a test of whether or not we're advancing equity. Are we advancing it by providing affordable housing so that people have a platform from which to improve their lives? Are we advancing it, the function of where people work, by opening the job markets to the maximum extent possible and really getting serious about relating city economies to the emerging economies with a view on how we employ people in these settings? Cities as places where people learn, not only public schools and K through 12, but accession to community college and the university setting and technical training and remedial education and all of the other dimensions of human capital investment that are warranted, and so forth and so on. So my sense is that it is time to talk, that it is appropriate to talk about models of place-based strategies, but that it's also time to overlay a layer of how we make place-based strategies advance the equity agenda. And I can tell you from my experience, this is something we can do. It's being done in bits and pieces across the country, particular cities, particular nonprofits, particular strategies. We can do this, and it should be the direction that research like this takes. Thank you very much for allowing me to come over and bring some thoughts to this session.
An agreement and a question. I opened a talk the other day by saying that I wanted to describe a small inner ring suburb, about 25,000 people, kind of built for the white working class, deindustrialized, huge minority population moves in, and a police system that's now sort of creating fiscal revenues for the city by preying on its own people. And I said, of course, I'm describing Maywood, California, right? So you're absolutely right. There are many places like this.
Many.
And the question that I've had that was raised really by something Alan Berube said on the first day about how so much of this place-based effort, the paper, rightly focuses in on cities, is how do you actually take this to some of these inner ring suburbs? If we're to think about place-based interventions, equity interventions in these inner ring suburbs that have very weak civic infrastructure, very weak social services, and very weak movement organizing infrastructure, which is the sort of thing that, for example, in San Antonio helped bring along with your work, bring the concerns of West San Antonio and poor parts of San Antonio to city attention. How do you actually address this and build the infrastructure necessary in these suburbs?
Well, it's a serious challenge, and I would say there are two responses. One is at the community level itself, where political change needs to occur. People were running for office in Ferguson who were African American for the first time in the history of Ferguson. And so the raising of the voice within the political system of a place like Ferguson itself, which then leads to change in the makeup of the police department and the policies of the department and the efforts to deal with the housing shortfall and so forth. So one of them is political and activism within the community itself. The other, which I think has very important place, and we haven't done this very well in this country, we need to begin thinking about this in serious ways, is the metropolitan governance structure and how we channel substantial resources to these places that don't have the benefit of the city government of St. Louis, which has had a long experience in poverty neighborhoods and harnessing the economy. But the real challenge is the metropolitan scale. In many communities, that's where the economic activity really is. The new economy is at the airport, in the industrial parks that surround it, in the new research parks that have come up out in the counties, in the what Joel Garreau called the edge cities, which are part of the county but are major office nodes, sometimes with as much square footage of office space as exists in the downtown central business district. In fact, many times. And figuring out how to tap those resources that are county-wide or even multi-county, and then deal with the specific needs in places that don't have the benefit of a strong local government. That's a really important strategy, because more and more in our country, the old central city, name one, and I think it'll verify what I say, is a smaller and smaller percentage of the population of the metropolitan area. And as a result, we tend to think about dealing with Baltimore as the city limits of Baltimore, but the truth of the matter is that it's a much bigger metro, and we're really ignoring a whole range of economic activities and economic potentials and social needs in the broader platform. And really that is the basis on which we have to think about these metropolitan engines. Bruce Katz and his team at Brookings have taken us a long way in our understanding of these. Alan was here, I gather, yesterday. Bruce worked with me at HUD. He was the chief of staff of the department, and he was thinking about these things even then. But I like to say that the way to think about a city is what you see when you fly in to the airport at night. And you see nothing that resembles city limits. You see nothing that has boundaries that say, here's where the city of Kansas City ends, or here's where Detroit ends. What you see is a mass of lights. That's the functioning organism that is the metropolitan area. And the problems of building an economy, the problems of trading activity and business exchange and job patterns and transportation patterns that's the context for it, not some look on the map at where a red line is that says this is the last avenue that is Detroit, and beyond that is Dearborn. And so thinking about how we not only begin to understand the metropolitan organism, but governance for it that is appropriate to our times, this new reality is an important part of the answer to your question.
Beautiful framing, and I think you probably got a lot of us on the edge of our chairs at the end when you said there are examples of what the equitable city looks like, and you've talked a little further now about what sound like success conditions in terms of the metropolitan setup and so on. Would you be willing to give a few examples? And,
well, just
no.
from my own, kind of thinking about this, there are cities that have really worked at it. And one of them that I would cite is Boston in Mayor Menino's time. Great man, great mayor, just passed away. He served until the till last year, and then we lost him soon thereafter. But a combination of things. Boston is, of course, an idea center, and so a lot of bright people from Harvard and MIT and the other schools stay in Boston. I was always impressed with what kind of young talent they had, for example, in their affordable housing sector. Just a lot of really aggressive nonprofits and such. But Mayor Menino understood this notion of kind of using the city's resources for equity purposes. For example, he had a strategy about 10 years ago that he called the backstreet strategy, which was not just economic development writ large, Route 128 and the computer companies, and not just economic development the way it occurs in some cities, which is more office space, downtown office towers for the law firms and the accounting firms. But the backstreet strategy was helping the non-glamorous small businesses thrive on the back streets of Boston. And it was a measurable progress in terms of the number of firms, the number of jobs created, a real effort. So that's an example, just one program. But when you combine that then with initiatives in housing and initiatives in education and initiatives in training, as Boston traditionally has, you got a place that actually has some lift and that avoids the worst of the social crises. Now, Boston's a big city, so it's had its share of problems. School busing and segregated neighborhoods, but progress, and progress with a kind of an equity component. So that would be one place that I would, pick and mention as an example. Examples of metropolitan areas that are working across boundaries. I guess I'd say the Dallas area, which has traditionally been competitive with Fort Worth, but they learned their lessons in the 60s and started an overt effort to come together, and the result was DFW Airport, which is now one of the largest airports in the country, linked to China and Europe, and around it has emerged not just businesses, telecommunications, high technology, but working with the inner suburbs, places like Arlington, between Dallas and Fort Worth. In Dallas, it isn't couched in social equity terms, but in more Chamber of Commerce language. And nevertheless, it's created a level of prosperity that is shared, and that is tended to, I think, to be important. I would say Atlanta, which started as social equity in the central city, which early on had African-American leadership in the form of several mayors, and then that African-American leadership began to be seen in the outer counties, Fulton County, and some of the others that make up the Atlanta metropolitan region. And there's at least a discussion there that is in contrast to what you saw in Detroit in the 1980s and 90s, when the rest of the region basically said, leave Detroit on its own. And by the way, the leadership of Detroit didn't want anything to do with the outer counties either. So there was a real impasse and contentiousness that began to break down when Dennis Archer became the mayor and created a Southeast Michigan coalition to focus on jobs creation. But it's a very delicate process, because we're talking about the concentrated power of the central city, the more disaggregated power in the suburban settings, and finding some umbrella structures to bring people together. Those are just a couple of examples, I think, that I would cite. Manuel, you have studied this question. Do you have other examples where some of these equity ideas have played out?
Yeah, you can't say this, so I will. San Antonio, Texas. If you look over the last 30 years...
That's why I recognized him.
Actually, he didn't pay me. If you look at the economic performance of San Antonio, Texas, relative to the rest of the southern census region against which you would benchmark it, its growth has been better, and its equity in terms of not having so much of a deterioration in the income distribution has been better as well. There's been a massive change politically in terms of the incorporation of Latinos into the political structure. And when you go to San Antonio today, it's a place where it got the choice neighborhood, promise zone designation, and everybody there talks about collaboration. In the last 2012 election, they passed a pre-K a tax to support pre-K in the city for disadvantaged folks with the support of the Chamber of Commerce, who viewed it as being an investment in the workforce of 20 years from now. But the key thing about San Antonio, which I would lift up and you and I have talked about, is it's not just a story of collaboration. If you started in San Antonio 35 years ago, the west side of San Antonio, very disadvantaged, disenfranchised, as well as the east side, which is more the African-American side. And it was a set of political struggles and uncomfortable conversations that put equity into the mix. So conflict is also part of collaboration in San Antonio, which you can't say has done well at both.
Thank you, Manuel. I would say, just as Manuel was talking, I was thinking about other examples, and they're examples for different reasons, and I won't go into them now. And they're not always equity-driven, but places where the economic collaboration or collaboration has yielded economic progress, which has equity implications, are Charlotte, I think, and Chattanooga, Tennessee, I think, and Denver, and I would say Seattle and Portland. Those would be some that come, Minneapolis, those would be some that come to mind. The former mayor of Seattle is here, Norm Rice. Stand and let us recognize you, Norm. Am I right to include Seattle? Oh, yes. Jim, thank you very much. Thanks for the opportunity to come over and be part of this.
I'm like Tanya, I'm not going to follow that. So let me just thank the many people who made this possible, starting with the members of the National Advisory Board, those that participated in the 5 discussion groups, the panelists the last 2 days, and all of you for attending. And I would be remiss if I didn't thank our sponsors again, the Ford Foundation, thanks, Sav, JP Morgan Chase, Bank of America, the California Endowment, and Annie Casey Foundation. They made this all possible, so thank them too. And so my concluding comment is simply a quote from John Gardner, who said, "What we have before us are some breathtaking opportunities disguised as insolvable problems." So let's get to work.